Hi, my name is Oswald Sobrino. This is a short book video on my latest book in my series, 5 Lessons from Great Thinkers. This one is the philosopher Hegel from Germany back in the early 1800s. He died in 1831. Hegel, I'm sure you've heard the name, is quite influential in the history of philosophy. Historically, he's probably most famous for influencing Karl Marx. They didn't have anything politically in common, but Marx took from Hegel's view of a dialectical process in history, he took that idea and applied it in his own way to his view of economics and changes in the economic system through history. What is dialectical? We hear that a lot, especially beginning with those who have studied Plato. A dialectic is simply a process of clashing opposing views, and after that clash, some insight, some truth emerges that preserves the best of the opposing views while canceling out the inadequacy of each opposing view, but preserving its best. That is the dialectic that Hegel applies to the history of philosophy. So in this book, in my series, 5 Great Thinkers, Hegel has many writings, complicated and truthfully difficult to understand. But I focus on lectures that Hegel gave on the history of philosophy. Specifically, I focus on the introduction he wrote to his lectures on the history of philosophy. Other writers focus on Hegel's philosophy of history. And that's good because that's a very accessible way to introduce beginners to Hegel. Peter Singer does that in his very good, very short introduction to Hegel published by Oxford University Press, which I highly recommend and which I reference in my book. I choose a different path. I choose to focus on Hegel's view of the history, not just history in general, but the history of philosophy. Walter Kaufmann is a famous philosopher who wrote on existentialism and on Nietzsche. He also wrote on Hegel, and he's another great source that you'll see in my book for learning more about Hegel. He tells us that the culmination of Hegel's life work was the history of philosophy, because he saw in the history of philosophy how absolute spirit or reason unfolded in the history of philosophy through the great heroes and thinkers of philosophy, culminating in the truth which Hegel did feel that at his time and age, at his point in history, in his life, he had provided the most complete philosophy possible that arose from the unfolding of absolute spirit. That didn't mean that Hegel thought his was the permanent fulfillment of philosophy, because he viewed the absolute spirit or reason unfolding in every generation. So I will introduce that there. Let me read a little portions of my introduction to give you a flavor of this book project. Hegel lived 1770 to 1831. He's the most famous philosopher in what's called idealism after Immanuel Kant. And as I said, I choose to focus on Hegel's philosophy concerning the history of philosophy. Following the view of Hegel's scholar Walter Kaufmann, I focus on Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy as the climax of Hegel's life work. It's interesting that Hegel viewed religion as also a manifestation of absolute spirit, but he viewed philosophy as superior than religion because philosophy engaged in pure thinking, while religion revealed the truths of absolute spirit in a pictorial or sensuous way. What else from the introduction? My own method for penetrating Hegel is to highlight his emphasis on life as necessary development through reason. This makes sense because for Hegel, history and the stages of philosophy are the records of humanity's search for truth through reason. So development is central to Hegel, and I believe that is his biggest contribution. And so I pursue this book by considering his introduction to the history of philosophy, the development of the truth unfolding in philosophy. Why do I like writing on Hegel at this point? Because I've written a multi-volume series on great thinkers, and Hegel sort of gives us the value of looking at the great thinkers in history, because absolute spirit unfolds, or reason or absolute truth unfolds to some degree in each of those thinkers. So we can even think of Hegel as the secular patron saint of those of us that are fascinated by the history of philosophy. So what else about Hegel do I want to mention? Various overview characteristics. He's clearly a rationalist. He believes the real is reason, the actual is reason, okay? But his rationalism is very different from that of others. It is very organic. It is very developmental. I would call him a process thinker. It's also very much focused on historical unfolding or development, so we can call him an historicist. And he's a vitalist. He celebrates life. He celebrates and loves the concrete. At first, that's kind of jarring. A rationalist tends to emphasize the abstract, which we take as the opposite of the concrete. But Hegel sees reason and the dialectic as extremely concrete, and that he views the abstract as inadequate, but when we see the organic unfolding of reason in history, there we get the concrete. That's better than the abstract and better than the merely sensual perceptions that we have. So Hegel is very interesting, very important in Western history, in the history of thought, a major influence on Karl Marx, although they did not share the politics. His idea of development and the dialectical development of truth and insight, which goes back to Socratic dialogues and Plato, influences not just philosophy, but many other areas like anthropology and the social sciences and psychology. So Hegel is a good adventure. This is a good way to be introduced to what is admittedly a hard to understand scholar by looking at his philosophy of history. You will have, after reading this book, a certain familiarity with Hegel, which will prepare you, if you wish, to tackle some of his more complicated works. Thank you.